Thank you for joining in today's cryptid horror story. Today's story is called The Weight of the Mist. This is a horror story about the Fear Liath, or also known as the Big Gray Man of MacDhui. And in this story, a seasoned guide with a pragmatic approach to the Cairngorms, and a researcher specializing in folklore and anomalous psychology. They ascends Ben Macdui and the Scottish Cairngorms. When the mist closes in, they are stalked by the Fear Liath Big Gray Man, an ancient entity that synchronizes its footsteps with theirs, induces psychological dread, mimics the voices of dead loved ones, and crushes its victims flat. Now for today's cryptid horror story, I hope you all enjoy. The Weight of the Mist. The audio file recovered from the GoPro Hero 11 Black, serial number CHDHX111XX, began its playback in absolute silence. The first 43 minutes were indistinguishable from a dead recording, a void of white noise so complete that the technicians at the Grampian Police Evidence Processing Lab initially marked it as corrupted data, another piece of mountain debris to be filed away and forgotten. It was only during the second review, conducted at 2 in the morning by a junior officer named Sarah Henwick, who had been ordered to catalog the equipment recovered from the Cairngorm Massif, that the first anomaly manifested. At 43 minutes and 17 seconds, a sound emerged from the silence that made Sarah remove her headphones and stare at the waveform on her computer screen, with a confusion that would later be described in her incident report as profound and disorienting. The sound was that of a single footstep, impossibly heavy, the distinct crunch of igneous rock being pulverized into powder beneath a weight that no human foot could generate. There was no preamble, no approach, no buildup of sound. One moment there was nothing, and the next there was the unmistakable percussion of stone being annihilated. 4 seconds after the footstep, a voice spoke, barely above a whisper, so close to the microphone that the speaker's breath caused the capsule to peak and distort. The voice was male, ragged with exhaustion and something far more primal than mere fatigue, and the words it spoke would be analyzed by linguists, psychologists, and paranormal investigators for the next decade without consensus. It is not following us. It is waiting for us to arrive. The recording continued for another 11 minutes, though what followed that whisper was a cacophony that the digital compression algorithm struggled to process. There were sounds of wind that moved with intentionality, of fabric tearing, of something organic being compressed with such force that the resulting noise resembled wetwood snapping under tremendous load. The police refused to release the full recording to the public, and the families of the deceased were advised by legal counsel that pursuing its complete contents would serve no purpose beyond extending their trauma. But the fragment that leaked, the 43 minutes of silence followed by the single crushing step and the whispered admission of predetermination, became the foundation of a legend that would haunt the Cairngorms for generations to come. It was the sound of inevitability made audible, of something so ancient and patient that it did not need to chase its prey, because the prey had already entered the trap the moment they set foot on the mountain. Callum MacAllister had been guiding groups through the Scottish Highlands for 18 years when he first heard the leaked audio recording. He sat in his cottage in Aviemore, the wind rattling the single-pane windows that overlooked the invisible peaks of the Cairngorm Plateau, and listened to it 3 times through expensive studio headphones that he used for mixing the traditional folk music he played in the local pubs during the off-season. By the third playthrough, he had identified the precise location where the recording had been made, not through any geographical marker or navigational clue, but through the specific quality of the silence that preceded the footstep. It was the silence of the Larig GHRU, that vast corridor of nothingness that bisected the Cairngorms, a silence so total and so suffocating that it had been described by climbers for centuries as a presence rather than an absence. Callum recognized it because he had heard it himself, dozens of times, in the moments before the mist rolled in, and transformed the plateau from a navigable landscape into a white labyrinth where time and direction lost all meaning. He was 42 years old, with the weathered hands and permanent squint of a man who had spent more of his life exposed to the elements than sheltered from them. His hair was the color of the granite he climbed, shot through with silver that had appeared prematurely in his 30s after a winter ascent of Brariach had gone wrong and left him frostbitten and hallucinating on a ledge for 14 hours, until a rescue helicopter had spotted the reflective tape on his jacket. That experience had not diminished his love for the mountains. If anything, it had deepened it, given him a respect that bordered on reverence. He understood that the highlands were not hostile, but they were utterly indifferent to human survival, and that indifference was a kind of majesty that demanded humility. He took that understanding into every climb, every guided expedition, every lecture he gave to nervous clients who had read too many adventure books and not enough topographical maps. Elena Vasquez arrived at the mountain rescue, briefing 2 days after Callum had received the contract for the expedition that would become the subject of the leaked recording. She was 34, a researcher in anomalous psychology and European folklore at the University of Edinburgh, and she had the kind of academic intensity that made her seem constantly distracted by thoughts that were more interesting than whatever conversation she happened to be participating in. Her hair was dark and usually tied back in a practical ponytail, though strands frequently escaped to frame her face in a way that she found irritating, and that most of her colleagues found unconsciously attractive. She wore hiking boots with her professional attire, a habit born from years of field research that had taught her that academic meetings about wilderness phenomena were often followed by actual wilderness excursions, and that the transition was smoother when one was already appropriately shod. The meeting had been arranged by the Scottish Mountaineering Council, which had received a substantial grant from a private donor to investigate what they euphemistically termed recurring anomalous incidents on Ben Macdui, the highest peak in the Cairngorms and the second highest in Britain. The grant was substantial enough to fund a fully equipped expedition, and the donor's requirements were specific. The team must include both a professional guide and an academic researcher specializing in the folklore associated with the mountain. The council had contacted Callum first, citing his impeccable safety record and his intimate knowledge of the terrain, and they had found Elena through her published work on the psychological effects of isolation in mountainous environments. Specifically her controversial paper on The Big Gray Man of Ben Macdui, which had argued that the legendary entity was not a supernatural phenomenon, but a manifestation of collective stress response triggered by specific atmospheric conditions unique to the plateau. Callum had read Elena's paper during the preparation phase, and he found her hypothesis both intellectually compelling and experientially incomplete. She had identified the correct variables: the sudden drops in temperature, the rapid formation of ground-hugging mist, the acoustic anomalies that caused footsteps to echo with impossible clarity or disappear entirely, the optical effects of light refracting through ice crystals in the air that could produce phantom figures at the edge of vision. What her paper lacked, Callum felt, was any acknowledgement of the qualitative experience of these phenomena, the way they felt not like random environmental events, but like intentionality, like the mountain itself was choosing to reveal or conceal itself according to some criteria that human perception could not access. He had considered raising this objection during their first meeting, but had decided against it, sensing in Elena's precise, careful speech a defensiveness that suggested she had heard similar criticisms before and had developed arguments against them that she was eager to deploy. The expedition group that assembled at the Cairngorm mountain base on the morning of September 14th consisted of 6 people: Callum and Elena in their professional capacities, and 4 amateur climbers who had paid premium rates for what the promotional material described as an exclusive, challenging ascent of Ben Macdui with expert guidance and historical commentary. The clients were a mixed group, united primarily by their disposable income and their desire for experiences that could be photographed and shared as evidence of their adventurousness. There was Marcus Whitfield, a venture capitalist from London in his early 50s, who had the lean, overconditioned physique of a man who treated his body as an investment portfolio, allocating resources to its maintenance with the same calculation he applied to his stock trades. He wore clothing that cost more than Callum's monthly mortgage payment, technical fabrics in aggressive colors that marked him as someone who purchased equipment for its signaling value rather than its functional utility. Beside Marcus stood his companion, a woman named Jennifer Caldwell, who was introduced as his climbing partner, though the dynamic between them suggested a relationship that was either romantic or mercenary, possibly both. Jennifer was 28, blonde, with the kind of symmetrical beauty that seemed to require constant maintenance. She had climbed exactly twice before, both times on indoor walls with automated belay systems, and she carried her rented ice axe with the self-conscious awkwardness of someone who had been told it was essential, but had not yet internalized why. She photographed everything with her phone, including the briefing room, the equipment racks, and the faces of the other climbers, creating a digital record that she would later regret with an intensity that would require years of therapy to process. The other two clients were brothers, Thomas and Henry Blackwood, who had inherited a manufacturing fortune from their father and had spent their adult lives converting that fortune into experiences that might fill the void where purpose should have been. Thomas was the elder by 3 years, 35, with a beard that he had cultivated specifically for this trip, because he believed it gave him the appearance of a seasoned mountaineer. Henry was 32, quieter, more observant, with the nervous hands and darting eyes of someone who was participating in the expedition out of fraternal obligation rather than personal desire. He had confided to Callum during the equipment check that he suffered from panic attacks in enclosed spaces, a revelation that had prompted Callum to spend an extra 10 minutes explaining the psychological effects of whiteout conditions and the techniques for managing disorientation. Techniques that Henry had listened to with the polite attention of someone who knows they are being prepared for something they would rather avoid. The morning was clear when they set out, the sky above the Cairngorms a brittle blue that promised visibility and stable conditions. The temperature at the base was just above freezing, typical for mid-September at altitude, and the wind was negligible, a gentle breeze that carried the scent of heather and cold stone. Callum led the group onto the path that wound up toward the northern quarries, setting a pace that was deliberately conservative, conscious that his client's fitness levels varied, and that exhaustion was the precursor to poor decision-making. Alina walked near the rear of the group, her notebook in her hand, occasionally making observations about the terrain or asking Callum questions about the specific geological formations they passed. Questions that seemed designed to establish her credibility as a researcher, but that also served the practical purpose of keeping her alert and engaged with her surroundings. Marcus maintained a steady stream of conversation as they climbed, anecdotes about his business dealings that were intended to impress, but that mostly served to reveal the narrowness of his experience. He spoke about the time he had climbed Kilimanjaro, about his plans to attempt Mont Blanc the following spring, about the personal trainer he employed specifically to prepare him for altitude challenges. Jennifer listened with the fixed smile of someone who had heard these stories many times before, her phone periodically emerging from her pocket to capture the increasingly dramatic views of the strath below. The Blackwood brothers walked in relative silence, Thomas occasionally pointing out a bird or a rock formation with the authoritative tone of someone who had read about such things in a guidebook, Henry maintaining a pace that kept him near the center of the group, neither at the front where the exposure was greatest nor at the rear where the isolation was most pronounced. By mid-morning, they had reached the plateau, that vast, undulating expanse of granite and schist that formed the roof of the Cairngorms. The visibility was still excellent, the surrounding peaks visible in sharp relief against the sky, and the group paused for a rest break, consuming energy bars and water while Callum checked the weather forecast on his satellite communicator. The prediction was for continued clear conditions until late afternoon, when a front was expected to bring cloud cover and possible precipitation. He calculated that they had ample time to reach the summit, spend an hour there as planned, and begin their descent before the weather deteriorated. It was a standard itinerary, one he had executed dozens of times without incident, and he felt the familiar calm that came from competence, from the knowledge that he was operating well within his capabilities. Elena stood slightly apart from the group during the break, her attention directed not at the views but at the sky above the western horizon, where a line of cloud was beginning to form with a speed that seemed, to her trained observation, slightly anomalous. She noted it in her journal, describing the formation as rapid and localized, with characteristics suggesting orographic lift rather than frontal progression. She did not mention this observation to Callum, not because she wanted to conceal it, but because she was not yet certain what it meant, and she had learned through years of field work that premature speculation could create anxieties that became self-fulfilling prophecies. Instead, she packed her notebook away and rejoined the group, accepting a piece of chocolate from Jennifer and making small talk about the difficulty of the terrain, conversation that felt increasingly artificial as the morning wore on and the atmosphere on the plateau began to shift in ways that her scientific vocabulary struggled to capture. The mist began to form at 11:47, according to the timestamp on Jennifer's phone, which she was using to document the expedition for her social media followers. One moment the plateau was clear, the surrounding topography visible for miles in every direction, and the next a wall of white appeared at the western edge of their field of vision, moving with a speed that Callum later described in his statement as not natural, not meteorologically possible. It was not a gradual envelopment, the typical progression of cloud formations that climbers learn to anticipate and manage. It was a sudden occlusion, as if a curtain had been drawn across the landscape, erasing the world beyond a radius of 20 meters and leaving them isolated in a void of perfect, luminous white. Callum's training asserted itself immediately. He gathered the group into a tight formation, issued instructions for maintaining visual contact, and began to navigate using his compass and the topographical map that he carried in a waterproof case. The compass was a high-quality Silva model, calibrated that morning, and he had used it in conditions far worse than this without error. But when he checked the bearing that should have pointed them toward the summit, he found the needle wavering in a manner that he had never observed before, oscillating between north and northeast with a regularity that suggested not magnetic interference but something more deliberate, as if the magnetic field itself were breathing. He did not share this observation with the group. Instead, he relied on dead reckoning, using the slope of the terrain and his memory of the plateau's topography to maintain a rough heading toward the summit. The clients, initially exhilarated by the dramatic change in conditions, began to show signs of unease as the minutes stretched into hours and the mist showed no signs of dissipating. Marcus's confident anecdotes gave way to increasingly impatient questions about their location and estimated time of arrival. Jennifer's photography shifted from celebratory to compulsive, as if she believed that documenting the white void would somehow render it manageable. The Blackwood brothers walked closer together than before, their shoulders almost touching, and Henry's breathing became audible, a shallow, rapid respiration that Callum recognized as the precursor to hyperventilation. Elena moved through the mist with a researcher's detachment, noting the specific qualities of the phenomenon that surrounded them. It was not ordinary fog, she realized. It had a density that seemed to resist movement, a viscosity that made walking feel like wading. The light within it was diffuse and directionless, producing no shadows and making depth perception nearly impossible. Objects at a distance of 10 meters were indistinguishable from objects at a distance of 50. The mist created a compression of space that was profoundly disorienting. She had read accounts of similar conditions in the literature on the Big Gray Man, reports from climbers who had described the mist on Ben Macdui as having a presence, a quality of intentionality that separated it from ordinary meteorological events. She had dismissed those accounts as subjective impressions, the projection of human psychology onto random environmental conditions. But as she walked through this particular mist, feeling it cling to her clothing and skin with a persistence that felt almost deliberate, she found her skepticism wavering in ways that she would later find deeply unsettling. The first psychological distortion occurred at approximately 1:30, when Jennifer stopped walking and stood motionless in the mist, her head tilted to one side as if listening to something that the others could not hear. Callum, who had been leading the group, noticed her absence within seconds and backtracked to find her standing with her boots submerged in a shallow pool of meltwater that had formed in a depression in the granite. The pool was no more than 2 centimeters deep, barely enough to wet the leather of her boots, but she was staring at it with an expression of profound horror, her eyes wide and her mouth slightly open. "My boots are filling," she said, her voice flat and matter-of-fact, completely at odds with the terror in her expression. "They're filling with water, and it's cold, it's so cold, and I can't feel my feet anymore." Callum looked at her boots, which were barely damp, and at her face, which was the color of old paper. "Jennifer," he said, keeping his voice calm and authoritative, "your boots are fine. There's a small puddle, but it's not inside your boots. Can you feel your toes? Wiggle them for me." She didn't move. "I can't feel them," she repeated. "The water is rising. It's up to my ankles now. It's going to keep rising until it fills my lungs." Marcus arrived behind Callum, his face flushed with annoyance rather than concern. "Jennifer, what are you doing? We're falling behind, come on." "She's experiencing a dissociative episode," Alina said, appearing from the mist with her researchers' calm intact. "It's not uncommon in whiteout conditions. The sensory deprivation triggers anxiety responses that can manifest as somatic hallucinations. Jennifer, I need you to focus on my voice. Look at my face, not at your feet." It took 15 minutes to coax Jennifer into moving again, 15 minutes during which Callum became increasingly aware of the time they were losing and the whether they were not outrunning. When she finally began to walk, she moved with the stiff, mechanical gait of someone who was performing an action that had been explained to them but not internalized, and her eyes remained fixed on the ground in front of her, searching for the water that her mind insisted was there. The second distortion followed shortly after, this time affecting Thomas Blackwood. He had been walking without incident since Jennifer's episode, maintaining his position near the front of the group, and occasionally making comments about the adventure they were having that were intended to be bracing but came across as hollow. Then, without warning, he stopped and pressed his hands against his temples, his face contorting into a mask of agony. "There's someone inside my head," he gasped, his voice rising to a pitch that was nearly a scream. "I can feel them watching through my eyes. They're using me like a camera, like a fucking camera, and they're laughing at what I'm seeing." Henry grabbed his brother's arm, his own panic temporarily overridden by concern. "Thomas, there's no one in your head. It's the altitude, it's making you confused." "Get out of my head," Thomas shrieked, and he struck himself in the face with his own fist, a blow that split his lip and sent blood streaming down his chin. "Get out, get out, get out." Callum and Alina managed to restrain him, but the incident left the group shaken in ways that the physical challenge of the climb had not. Thomas sat on a rock, his head in his hands, moaning softly, while Henry tried to clean the blood from his face with a tissue that quickly became saturated. Marcus, who had been increasingly agitated by the delays, demanded that Callum make a decision about whether to continue or turn back, and his voice carried an edge of accusation that suggested he held the guide personally responsible for the deterioration of conditions. "We're continuing to the summit," Callum said, his voice harder than he intended. "The mist will clear, it always does, and once we reach the summit we can assess our options for descent. Turning back now would be more dangerous than continuing, because we'd be navigating the same terrain without the benefit of the summit's landmarks." He did not mention that the landmarks he was referring to were currently invisible, or that his compass was still behaving erratically, or that his own skin was beginning to prickle with a sensation that he could not identify, but that his instincts recognized as fear. He was the professional, the expert who had been hired to manage exactly these kinds of situations, and he understood that his confidence was the only thing keeping the group from complete disintegration. If he showed doubt, if he allowed the terror that was beginning to gnaw at his own composure to become visible, then the expedition would collapse into panic, and panic on a mountain in whiteout conditions was a death sentence. They resumed walking, the six of them strung out in a line that was supposed to maintain visual contact, but that was increasingly difficult to keep closed in the compressive opacity of the mist. Callum led, his eyes fixed on the ground in front of him, his mind calculating distances and bearings with a precision that felt increasingly like self-deception. Alina followed, her notebook forgotten, her attention focused on the subtle changes in the mist that she could not quite define, but that her body registered as threat. Marcus and Jennifer walked together now, their earlier dynamic of confident leader and admiring companion replaced by a mutual dependency that was born of shared fear. The Blackwood brothers brought up the rear, Thomas still muttering to himself about the presence in his mind, Henry supporting him with an arm around his shoulders, and a look of desperate determination on his face. It was during this period of forced march, when the group had been walking in the mist for nearly 3 hours, and the afternoon was beginning to transition toward evening, that the sound first emerged. It was not loud, not initially. It was a subtle percussion that blended so completely with the ambient noise of wind and shifting rock that Callum almost missed it. But his ear, trained through decades of mountain travel to detect anomalies in the acoustic environment, picked it out from the background and isolated it with the precision of a musician, identifying a single off-key note in an orchestral performance. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, the distinct crunch of stone being pulverized under immense weight. And they were synchronized with the group's pace. When Callum stopped walking to listen, the footsteps continued for exactly 1/2 second after his own movement ceased, as if whatever was making them required a moment to process the change in rhythm. Then they stopped, and the silence that followed was deeper and more absolute than the silence that had preceded them, a silence that seemed to have mass and texture, that pressed against the eardrums with physical force. "Did you hear that?" Henry asked, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Hear what?" Marcus demanded, but his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes were scanning the mist in the direction from which the sound had come. "Footsteps," Alina said, and her researcher's calm had cracked, revealing something beneath it that she would later identify in her own notes as primordial recognition. "Something is walking near us, something very large." "It's an echo," Marcus said, but the word came out as a question rather than a statement. "The mist creates acoustic anomalies. It's just our own footsteps bouncing back." "Then why did they continue after we stopped?" Callum asked, and the question hung in the air like a physical object, heavy and unanswerable. They stood in silence for a long moment, 6 human beings isolated in a white void, listening to the nothingness with an intensity that made their ears ring. Callum counted his heartbeats, reaching 47 before the sound returned. This time it was closer, the crunch of stone more distinct, and there was a quality to it that defied simple acoustic explanation. It was not the sound of a footstep on loose scree, the random distribution of pressure that produces a scatter of small noises. It was the sound of a single point of contact, a massive concentration of force applied to a specific location, the deliberate crushing of stone into powder. And it was keeping pace with them, not following, not approaching from behind, but moving in parallel, somewhere in the mist to their left, matching their speed with a precision that suggested not chance but intention. Callum made a decision then that he would later question in the long hours of the night, when sleep refused to come, and the memory of the mist pressed against his consciousness like a physical weight. He turned the group to the right, angling their course away from the sound, hoping to increase the distance between themselves and whatever was walking beside them. The terrain on the plateau was uneven but not dangerous, a series of low ridges and shallow valleys that could be navigated with care even in poor visibility, and he believed that a course correction of even 30 degrees would be sufficient to break the parallel movement. But the footsteps adjusted. When the group turned, the footsteps turned with them, maintaining their position to the left, maintaining their synchronization with the group's pace. And they were closer now, close enough that Callum could feel a subtle vibration through the soles of his boots, a transfer of kinetic energy through the bedrock that spoke of mass measured in tons rather than kilograms. "It's hurting us," Alina whispered, and the phrase was so unexpected, so far outside the vocabulary of her academic papers, that Callum turned to look at her with something like shock. "It's not hunting us. It's hurting us, moving us in a specific direction." "That's insane," Marcus said, but he was already moving in the direction the footsteps were guiding them, his body responding to the pressure before his mind could formulate resistance. "The Fear Liath," Thomas muttered, his voice distant and dreamy, as if he were reciting something he had learned in childhood. "The big gray man. It doesn't chase, it waits. It waits for you to come to it." "Thomas, shut up," Henry snapped, but his own feet were moving in the same direction as Marcus's, drawn by an impulse that none of them could articulate but that all of them felt. The mist thickened as they walked, if that were possible, becoming so dense that Callum could no longer see Alina, who was walking directly in front of him. He reached out and touched her shoulder, felt her flinch beneath his fingers, and understood that she was experiencing the same sensation he was. The feeling of being compressed, of the world contracting around them until they were walking through a tunnel of white that was barely wider than their own bodies. The footsteps continued, relentless, rhythmic, the sound of a metronome made from mountains. And then, without transition, they stopped. The silence that followed was the silence that had preceded the recording on the GoPro, the silence of absolute void, of a world from which all sound had been extracted. Callum stood frozen, his hand still on Alina's shoulder, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force that he could feel it in his throat. He waited for the footsteps to resume, for the sound to return with the inevitability of a heartbeat, but the silence stretched and deepened and became something that felt eternal. "It's gone," Jennifer said, her voice small and hopeful and utterly unconvincing. "No," Alina said, and her voice was different now, stripped of its academic detachment and reduced to a raw, animal recognition. "It's not gone. It's just stopped walking. It's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Henry asked. But before anyone could answer, the temperature dropped. It was not a gradual cooling, the typical progression of evening at altitude. It was a sudden plunge, as if someone had opened a door into a freezer. Callum felt it on his exposed skin first, a sharp bite that made him gasp, and then it penetrated his clothing, seeping through the technical fabrics that were rated for sub-zero conditions as if they were made of cotton. The air itself seemed to crystallize, each breath a lungful of ice that burned on inhalation and condensed into visible vapor on exhalation. And with the cold came the smell. It was a scent that Callum had never encountered before, a combination of wet slate and something older, something that spoke of deep places where the sun had never reached and the processes of decay operated on geological timescales. It was the smell of old graves, of crypts that had been sealed for centuries and opened without warning, of organic matter that had been preserved in darkness and was now exposed to air for the first time in millennia. It was the smell of the mountain's interior, of the spaces beneath the visible world, and it carried with it an implication of age so vast that human existence was merely a brief interruption in its persistence. "What is that?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. "The Fear Liath," Thomas said again, and this time there was no madness in his voice, only a terrible, resigned clarity. "The gray man, it's here. It's been here all along." And then the wind began to blow. Not the wind of weather systems and atmospheric pressure gradients, but a wind that moved with intentionality, that seemed to originate from a specific point in the mist and radiate outward in pulses that had a rhythm almost like breathing. It carried the smell in waves, each pulse stronger than the last, and with each pulse came a pressure against the eardrums, a sensation of being submerged in something denser than air. Callum felt it then, the thing that the climbers in the old accounts had described, the thing that Alina had tried to explain away as collective hallucination. It was a presence, a weight, a sense of being observed by something so large that its attention was a physical force. He could feel it pressing against his mind, not as a thought or an emotion, but as a simple, overwhelming fact. Something was here, something was watching, and something was waiting for them to make the mistake that would trigger whatever came next. He tried to speak, to issue instructions, to reassert his authority as the guide and restore order to a situation that was rapidly escaping his control. But his voice emerged as a whisper, barely audible even to himself, and the words he had intended to say dissolved into a single, involuntary utterance. "Run." He didn't know which of them moved first. Perhaps they all moved simultaneously, driven by the same impulse that bypassed reason and spoke directly to the ancient, prey-animal core of the brain. But they ran, 6 human beings fleeing through a white void toward an unknown destination, driven by the certainty that whatever was behind them was worse than whatever lay ahead. The footsteps resumed, but they were different now, no longer synchronized with the group's pace but accelerating, the crunch of stone becoming a rhythm of pursuit. And above the footsteps, or perhaps beneath them, or perhaps somehow inside them, there was a sound that Callum would carry with him for the rest of his life. A whisper, barely audible, that seemed to come from the mist itself, from the stones beneath their feet, from the air in their lungs. "It is not following us," the whisper said, and the voice was not human, not animal, not anything that could be identified by the taxonomies of biology or physics. "It is waiting for us to arrive." They ran, and the mist swallowed them. They ran until their lungs burned, and their legs threatened to collapse beneath them, until the rational part of Callum's mind that had been screaming for attention finally broke through the panic and forced him to stop. He stumbled to a halt, his hands on his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps that produced clouds of vapor so thick they seemed to solidify in the air before dissipating. One by one, the others slowed and stopped, forming a ragged cluster in the mist that was barely cohesive enough to be called a group. Jennifer had fallen to her knees and was sobbing silently, her face buried in her gloved hands. Marcus stood apart from the others, his back to them, his shoulders heaving with exertion and something that looked, from behind, like rage. The Blackwood brothers were leaning against each other, Thomas's earlier delirium replaced by a vacant exhaustion that was somehow more disturbing, Henry's face a mask of desperate determination that was beginning to crack around the edges. Alina was the only one who seemed to have retained any semblance of analytical composure, though her hands were shaking as she fumbled with her notebook, and her eyes darted constantly to the periphery of their little circle, searching the white void for whatever had been walking beside them. But the footsteps had stopped when they stopped, maintaining that terrible half-second delay that had become the signature of whatever was stalking them. And now there was only the wind and their own breathing, and the distant, muffled sound of water dripping somewhere in the invisible landscape. "We need to get our bearings," Callum managed, his voice rough and unfamiliar in his own ears. "Running blind is exactly what it wants. Whatever that was, whatever is making those sounds, it's trying to panic us into doing something stupid. We need to stop, think, and navigate properly. You don't know what it wants, Marcus spat, turning to face the group with an expression of such naked hostility that Callum took an involuntary step backward. You don't know anything. You're supposed to be the expert, the professional, and you've led us into a fucking death trap. Marcus, that's not fair, Alina said, but her voice lacked conviction and she was still scanning the mist. Fair, Marcus laughed, a harsh barking sound that contained no humor. What's fair about any of this? We're lost in a whiteout, something is walking beside us that we can't see, and people are losing their minds. Jennifer thinks her boots are full of water, Thomas thinks there's someone inside his head, and you, he pointed at Callum, you look like you're about to piss yourself. So don't talk to me about fair. We're all frightened, Callum said, and the admission cost him something, a fragment of the authority he had been struggling to maintain. But panic will kill us faster than any predator. We need to stay together, stay calm, and find a way off this plateau. The mist will clear eventually. It always does. Does it? Thomas asked, his voice distant and dreamy. Or is that just something you tell the tourists to keep them paying? Thomas, don't, Henry said, but his brother shook off his restraining hand. I've been reading about this place, Thomas continued, his eyes focused on something in the mist that only he could see. The big gray man, the Fear Liath, it's not a legend, it's a territorial response. The mountain creates it. The mountain needs it. We're not supposed to be here and the mountain knows it. That's enough, Callum said, more sharply than he intended. We're not having this conversation now. What we're going to do is reorient ourselves and start moving in a direction that makes sense. Alina, can you help me with the compass? But the compass, when Callum retrieved it from his pocket, was worse than before. The needle spun lazily, completing full rotations with a speed that suggested not magnetic interference but active malfunction. He tapped it, shook it, held it at different angles, but the needle continued its meaningless revolutions, pointing everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. It's dead, he said, and the word carried a weight that transcended its literal meaning. Everything's dead out here, Jennifer whispered, and when she looked up her eyes were wrong, pupils dilated to black pools that swallowed the color of her irises. The mist eats everything. It eats sound and light and direction and time. We're not on the mountain anymore. We're inside it. Jennifer, listen to me, Alina said, kneeling beside her and taking her hands in a gesture that was part comfort and part restraint. What you're experiencing is called spatial disorientation. It's a known phenomenon in whiteout conditions. Your brain is struggling to process the lack of visual reference points, and it's generating explanations that feel real but aren't. There is nothing inside the mist. There is nothing eating anything. We're just lost, and we need to find our way back. Then why? Jennifer asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to carry farther than it should have. Can I feel it breathing? The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable, and in the silence that followed, Callum realized that he could feel it too. Not breathing, exactly, but a rhythm in the air pressure, a subtle oscillation that matched the pulse in his own temples. It was as if the atmosphere itself had developed a heartbeat, a slow, ponderous thumping that was barely perceptible but impossible to ignore once noticed. And with each pulse came a wave of the dread that Thomas had named, a sensation of impending catastrophe that had no specific object but that settled on the chest like a physical weight. He had felt it before, he realized, in moments of his life that he had attributed to other causes. The night his father had died, when he had woken from a dreamless sleep with his heart hammering, and the certainty that something terrible had happened, confirmed an hour later by the phone call from the hospital. The afternoon on Brariach when he had been trapped by the storm, the moments before the first gusts hit when he had felt a stillness so absolute that it had seemed artificial, manufactured, the held breath before the scream. But those had been isolated incidents, moments of intuition that could be explained by subconscious processing of environmental cues. This was different. This was continuous, relentless, a pressure that was building with each minute they remained on the plateau. "We need to move," he said, and his voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. "North. The plateau slopes down to the north. If we can find the edge, we can follow it to the path." "Which way is north?" Marcus demanded. "Your compass is useless, the sun is invisible, and we're surrounded by nothing. You could be sending us in circles for all we know." "I know this mountain," Callum said, and the words were true, but they felt hollow, insufficient against the enormity of what was happening to them. "I've walked this plateau 100 times. I can feel the slope, trust me." "Trust you?" Marcus laughed again, that harsh, desperate sound. "You want us to trust you?" "Do you have a better option?" Elena asked, standing up and facing Marcus with an intensity that surprised them both. "Because if you do, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, we follow Callum and we stay together and we don't run. Running is what it wants. Running is how it hunts." "You don't know that," Marcus said. But his resistance was weakening, the energy of his anger dissipating into the all-consuming white. "No," Elena admitted. "I don't. But I know that scattered prey is easier to take than grouped prey. I know that panic kills more people in survival situations than exposure or dehydration. And I know that standing here arguing while something stalks us in the mist is the stupidest thing we could possibly do. So we're moving. Now." She took the lead, which was not her role but which she assumed with a determination that brooked no argument. Callum fell in beside her, grateful for the intervention and simultaneously resentful of his own gratitude. He was the guide, the professional, the one who was supposed to be in control, and the fact that he needed Elena to restore order was a wound to his self-conception that would fester long after the immediate danger had passed. They walked for what felt like hours but might have been minutes, time in the white void becoming as elastic and meaningless as distance. The slope that Callum had claimed to feel was barely perceptible, a gentle gradient that might have been descending toward the edge of the plateau or might have been rising toward some invisible summit. He walked with his right hand extended, fingers brushing the mist as if it were a wall that might provide tactile guidance, and he concentrated on the sensation of the ground beneath his boots, trying to read the topography through the soles of his feet as he had learned to do in whiteout training. The footsteps returned when they had been walking for what Callum estimated to be 40 minutes, though his estimate was worth nothing in a world without clocks or sun. They were closer now, so close that the crunch of stone was accompanied by a low-frequency vibration that Callum could feel in his sternum, a resonance that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to the bones of his skeleton. And there was something new in the sound, a quality that had not been present before, a rhythm. Not the simple synchronization of before, but a pattern, a sequence of heavy steps followed by pauses of precise duration, as if whatever was making the sound was counting, measuring, calculating. "It's faster," Henry whispered, and his voice was barely audible above the wind. "It's moving faster than us." "Don't stop," Callum said, but his own feet were slowing, his body responding to the proximity of the sound with a paralysis that felt like the prelude to death. "Keep walking. Don't run. Don't stop." But they did stop, all of them, drawn to a halt by a sound that was not the footsteps but something that accompanied them, a sound that seemed to emerge from the mist itself rather than from any physical source. It was a whisper, or perhaps many whispers overlapping, a susurrus of voices that spoke words that Callum could almost understand, but that dissolved into nonsense before his conscious mind could grasp them. And beneath the whispers, or perhaps woven through them, was a low hum, a dissonant chord that resonated in his teeth and his sinuses and produced a nausea that was more spiritual than physical. "Do you hear that?" Jennifer asked, and her voice was different now, stripped of its earlier hysteria and replaced by a flat, affectless calm that was somehow more disturbing. "The voices, they're singing." "There's no singing," Elena said, but her own face had gone pale, and she was pressing her hands against her ears in a gesture that was futile and self-aware in its futility. "It's the wind. Wind in the rocks makes sounds that resemble voices. It's a known phenomenon." "Then why," Jennifer asked, "do they know my name?" She turned to face the direction of the footsteps, and her expression was not one of fear but of recognition, as if she were greeting an old friend rather than confronting a predator. "Jennifer," the whisper said, and the voice was her own, perfectly reproduced, every intonation and inflection identical. "Jennifer, come here. It's warm here, it's safe. You don't have to be afraid anymore." "No." Marcus grabbed her arm and yanked her backward, and the spell was broken, the recognition in her eyes replaced by confusion and then terror. "Don't listen to it. Whatever it is, it's trying to trick you." "It knows my name," Jennifer repeated, and she was crying now, tears streaming down her face to freeze in the cold air. "It knows things about me, things I never told anyone." "What things?" Alina asked, her researcher's instincts momentarily overriding her fear. "The abortion," Jennifer said, and the word emerged from her mouth like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples of shock through the group. "When I was 19, I never told Marcus. I never told anyone, but it knew. It said, 'Jennifer, you don't have to carry the weight anymore. Come to where the weight is lifted.'" The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the footsteps, which had resumed their relentless approach. Marcus stared at Jennifer with an expression of such complex emotion, betrayal, confusion, fear, love, hate, that it was impossible to read. "You had an abortion?" he asked, and the question was so irrelevant, so utterly disconnected from the reality of their situation, that Callum wanted to scream. "Marcus, not now," he said, but Marcus was not listening. "We talked about children," Marcus continued, his voice rising. "We talked about it last month and you said you weren't ready, and I said that was fine and all along." "Marcus, shut up," Henry shouted, and the violence of his outburst shocked them all into silence. "We're going to die out here if we don't focus, and you're arguing about something that happened a decade ago. Get your fucking priorities straight." Marcus turned on him with a snarl, his hands curling into fists, and for a moment Callum thought they were going to fight, two grown men trading blows in the mist while death walked beside them. But then the temperature dropped again, a fresh plunge that felt like the opening of a door into absolute zero, and their argument died in their throats as the presence announced itself with a suddenness that made the previous hours of subtle stalking seem like mere prelude. The blur was the only word Callum could find for it, though it was inadequate to the point of absurdity. It was not a shape, not a form, not anything that could be described in terms of geometry or dimension. It was a smudge, a distortion, a region of the mist that was somehow denser and lighter simultaneously, a gray that was not a color but an absence of color, a negative space that seemed to occupy more of the visual field than the surrounding white without actually being visible. It was larger than it should have been, larger than the horizon, larger than the sky, and yet it was right there, close enough that Callum felt he could reach out and touch it if he dared to extend his arm. It moved, and the movement was wrong. It did not traverse the distance between 2 points. It existed at multiple points simultaneously, or perhaps it existed at no point at all and merely gave the impression of movement by rearranging the mist around it. There was no sound associated with its motion, no displacement of air, no vibration of the ground. But there was a sensation, a pressure against the mind that was the physical equivalent of the temperature drop, a coldness that was not thermal but existential, a certainty that something was here that should not be, could not be, and yet was. "Run," Thomas whispered, and this time there was no hesitation, no group coordination, no attempt at rational navigation. They ran, all 6 of them, scattering like birds from a cat, their earlier formation dissolving into chaos as each person fled in a different direction, driven by the ancient imperative of survival that transcended strategy and sanity. Callum ran with Alina beside him, their hands clasped in a grip that was painful and necessary, and behind them he could hear the others, their footsteps mingling with the crunch of the thing that followed. He did not look back. He knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that to look back would be to see something that the human mind was not equipped to process, something that would break him in ways that death would not. They ran until they could run no more, until their legs gave out and they collapsed onto the cold stone of the plateau, gasping for breath that burned in their lungs and emerged as clouds of vapor that seemed to hang in the air with an unnatural persistence. Elena was retching, her body convulsing with the aftermath of exertion and terror, and Callum held her shoulders, trying to steady her, trying to steady himself, trying to find some fragment of composure in a world that had dissolved into nightmare. "Where are the others?" Elena managed between spasms. Callum looked around, but the mist was absolute and there was nothing to see but white. "I don't know. We need to find them. We need to." The sound stopped him. It was not the footsteps this time, but something else, something that was simultaneously more terrible and more mundane. It was the sound of a body hitting stone from a great height, a wet, heavy impact that was followed by a silence so profound that it seemed to swallow the echo before it could form. And then, drifting through the mist, came a scream that was cut short with such abruptness that it was unclear whether the voice had stopped or simply ceased to exist. "Oh God," Elena breathed. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." "Stay here," Callum said, though he had no intention of leaving her alone and she had no intention of being left. "Stay behind me. Don't look. Whatever you do, don't look." They moved toward the sound of the impact, drawn by a horror that was stronger than their desire for safety. The mist parted around them as they walked, not gradually but in sudden gaps that revealed patches of stone and then closed again, as if the white void were taunting them with glimpses of a reality it refused to fully disclose. Callum walked with his ice axe raised, the ridiculousness of the gesture not lost on him, but overridden by the need to feel armed, to feel capable of resistance against something that was clearly beyond the reach of any weapon. They found Marcus first. He was lying on a flat outcropping of granite, his body positioned in a way that suggested he had fallen from above, though there was nothing above them but mist. But he had not fallen, Callum realized as he approached, because there were no signs of a fall, no scrapes or bruises that would indicate a tumble down a slope. He had simply arrived here, deposited on the stone by a force that had not bothered with the intermediate steps of physics. And he was flat. Not in the sense of lying down, but in the sense of having been compressed, as if a massive weight had been applied to his body with such force that it had reduced his three-dimensional form to something that was almost two-dimensional. His ribcage had collapsed inward, the bones pulverized into fragments that protruded through the skin of his back in a pattern that resembled the spokes of a shattered wheel. His skull was intact but misshapen, the facial bones pushed backward into the cranial cavity with a precision that suggested not random crushing but deliberate pressure. His arms were spread wide, the bones of the forearms shattered into compound fractures that jutted through the flesh at sharp angles, and his legs were bent backward at the knees, the joints dislocated and then compressed until the lower legs lay parallel to the thighs. But the worst part, the detail that would haunt Callum's dreams for the rest of his life, was Marcus's expression. His eyes were open, bulging slightly from their sockets due to the pressure that had been applied to his head, and they were not contorted in pain or terror. They were peaceful. They were serene. They were the eyes of a man who had seen something so vast and so terrible that the only possible response was acceptance, a surrender so complete that it had transcended suffering and arrived at a kind of ecstasy. "He didn't scream," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. "The scream we heard, it wasn't him." She was right, Callum realized. The impact sound had been Marcus's body hitting the stone, but the scream had come from somewhere else, somewhere distant in the mist. And even as he processed this realization, another sound reached them, a wet, tearing noise like fabric being ripped, followed by a gurgling that might have been breathing or might have been something else entirely. Jennifer, Elena said, and she was already moving, her researcher's detachment completely shattered, her face a mask of pure horror. We have to find her. We have to. Elena, wait. Callum grabbed her arm, but she pulled free with a strength that surprised him. She's still alive, Elena said, and her voice was raw, desperate. Didn't you hear it? She's still alive. They ran again, but this time there was no direction, no purpose beyond the terrible compulsion to witness what was happening to their companions. The mist swirled and parted, revealing glimpses of nightmare that closed again before they could be fully processed. Callum saw a flash of red, a spatter of blood against white stone, and then it was gone. He heard a voice that might have been Jennifer's, crying out for Marcus in tones of such desolate grief that it made his chest ache. And then he heard nothing, and the silence was worse than any sound could have been. They found Jennifer in a shallow depression between two boulders, her body positioned as if she had been crawling when something had reached down from above and simply removed the upper half of her torso. Her legs were still there, still attached to her pelvis, the bones of the hips shattered and the flesh torn in ragged strips that suggested not cutting but pulling, as if she had been drawn upward through a hole that was too small for her body. The vertebrae of her lower spine protruded from the ragged flesh of her abdomen, the spinal cord visible as a white thread that had been snapped, and then trailed in the blood that pooled around what remained of her. But it was not the violence of the wound that made Callum stagger backward and retch until his stomach was empty and his throat burned with bile. It was the fact that her legs were still moving. The muscles were still twitching, the feet still flexing and extending in a pathetic parody of walking, as if the lower half of her body had not yet received the message that the upper half no longer existed. And from somewhere in the mist above them, there was a sound like chewing, a wet, rhythmic compression that was followed by a swallowing noise so deep and so resonant that it seemed to come from the earth itself. "It's eating her," Elena said, and her voice was beyond emotion now, reduced to a flat statement of fact that was more terrible than any scream. "It's eating her from above." Callum looked up, but there was only mist, white and infinite and somehow hungry. He wanted to believe that Jennifer was already dead when the thing took her, that the chewing sound was something else, that the movement of her legs was a reflex, a neurological ghost. But he had heard her voice, had heard her call for Marcus with a clarity that meant she had been conscious, had been aware, had been watching whatever was above her reach down and... "We need to move," he said, and his voice was unrecognizable, a rasp of horror and self-preservation. "Now, right now." "What about the others?" Elena asked, though her eyes were fixed on Jennifer's legs, which had finally stopped moving. "The others are dead," Callum said, and the words emerged with a certainty that came from some place deeper than observation. "Thomas and Henry are dead. We need to survive. That's all we can do now. Survive." They moved away from the bodies, from the blood that was already freezing on the cold stone, from the chewing sounds that continued somewhere in the invisible sky above them. The mist had thickened again, if that were possible, becoming a soup that made walking feel like wading through a viscous fluid. Callum held Elena's hand with a grip that was painful and necessary, and they walked with no destination, no plan, no hope beyond the animal imperative to keep moving, to keep breathing, to stay alive for one more minute, one more second. And behind them, always behind them, came the footsteps, the rhythmic, relentless, perfectly synchronized crunch of stone being pulverized under impossible weight. The Fear Liath was not finished with them. It was waiting, patient as the mountain itself, for them to arrive at whatever destination it had chosen. "It is not following us," Callum whispered to himself, and the words were the echo of the recording, the prophecy that had been fulfilled before they ever set foot on the mountain. "It is waiting for us to arrive." They walked, and the mist swallowed them, and the footsteps walked with them, and the dread grew heavier with each passing moment, a weight that pressed against their minds and their bodies and their souls, a weight that would never be lifted, that would follow them down from the mountain and into whatever remained of their lives. The Fear Liath was not a legend. It was not a hallucination. It was real, and it was ancient, and it was hungry, and they were walking directly into its jaws. Callum and Alina walked without speaking, their silence born not from the absence of things to say, but from the superabundance of horrors that words could not contain. The mist moved around them in slow, deliberate currents, and Callum found himself imagining it as breath, the exhalation of something vast that surrounded them on all sides, something that inhaled and exhaled the white void through which they stumbled. He had lost all sense of direction. The slope he had claimed to feel earlier had flattened into indistinguishable undulations, and every direction looked identical to every other direction, a uniformity of white that was mathematically perfect and psychologically devastating. Alina walked beside him with her head down, her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her boots, and he could see the tremor in her hands that she was trying to conceal by keeping them buried in her jacket pockets. She had not looked at the bodies of Marcus and Jennifer for more than a few seconds, but those seconds had been sufficient to etch images into her memory that would never fade, that would resurface in dreams and waking moments with the vividness of fresh experience. She was a researcher, accustomed to analyzing death from a distance, through texts and photographs and second-hand accounts. The reality of it, the smell of blood and voided bowels and the wet, organic sounds of a body being consumed, had stripped away the protective layers of academic detachment and left her raw, exposed, defenseless. "We need to find shelter," Callum said, and his voice emerged as a croak, his throat dry from fear and exertion. "Even a rock overhang, something to break the wind." "There's no wind," Alina said, not looking up. "That's the problem. There's no wind, no sound, nothing, just the footsteps." She was right. The footsteps had been their constant companion since they had left the bodies, never approaching, never receding, maintaining a distance that was always just at the edge of perception. It was the auditory equivalent of the blur, something that was simultaneously present and absent, real and imagined, a sound that existed in the space between hearing and hallucination. Callum had tried to ignore it, to focus on the mechanical task of placing one foot in front of the other. But it was impossible to ignore something that synchronized itself so perfectly with your own movements, that existed as a shadow sound cast by your own footsteps. "It wants us to know it's there," Alina said, and there was a quality of insight in her voice that reminded Callum of her academic persona, the sharp analytical mind that she had applied to folklore and psychology. "The synchronization, the half-second delay, the way it stops when we stop, it's not trying to surprise us. It's trying to communicate, to establish a relationship." "A relationship," Callum's laugh was harsh, automatic, a reflex of disbelief. "It's killing us, Alina. It's not establishing a relationship, it's hunting us." "Yes," Alina said, and she finally looked up, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that was almost painful in the context of their surroundings. "But hunting is a relationship, predator and prey. The wolf doesn't hide from the deer. The wolf lets the deer know it's there because the fear makes the meat taste better, or because the fear drives the deer toward the pack, or because the fear is the point. This thing, the Fear Liath, the big gray man, whatever we call it, it doesn't just want to kill us. It wants us to be afraid. The fear is the food." "That's insane," Callum said, but the word felt hollow, insufficient. "Is it?" Alina asked. "Think about the accounts, the climbers who survived, the ones who made it off the mountain. They all described the same thing, not an attack but a presence, a weight, a dread that followed them down from the plateau and stayed with them for years. Some of them killed themselves. Some of them went mad. The ones who died on the mountain, the ones whose bodies were found, they weren't eaten, Callum. They were crushed, compressed, flattened. The creature didn't consume them for nourishment. It consumed them for something else." "What?" "I don't know," Alina admitted, and her voice cracked, the researcher momentarily overwhelmed by the human being. "But I think we're about to find out." The footsteps had stopped. Not the gradual fading of before, but an abrupt cessation, as if whatever was making them had simply ceased to exist. And in the silence that followed, the temperature began to rise. Not back to normal, not to the mild conditions of the morning, but to something else, something that felt like the interior of a fever, a warmth that was wrong in its intensity and its suddenness. "What's happening?" Callum asked, and his voice was small, reduced to the vulnerability of a child. "It's changing," Alina said, and there was wonder in her voice as well as fear, the researcher confronting a phenomenon that exceeded her theories. The Fear Liath isn't just one thing, it adapts. It changes its approach based on what we do, what we feel. We ran and it chased. We stopped and it waited. Now we're exhausted and it's... The sound that interrupted her was not a footstep, it was a voice. "Callum." The voice was his mother's. His mother, who had died when he was 12, who had been dead for 30 years, who he had not heard speak since the night before the cancer took her, when she had whispered, "I love you," into his ear with her last conscious breath. "Callum, come here, I'm waiting for you. It's warm here, it's safe." "No," he said, but his feet were moving, drawn by a gravity that was stronger than his will. "No, that's not real. You're not real." "Callum," the voice said again, and it was closer now, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from it, a warmth that smelled of baking bread and lavender and all the things that had been lost to time. "Don't be afraid. The mountain loves you. The mountain wants to hold you. Come to me, Callum. Come to where the weight is lifted." Alina grabbed his arm with both hands, her fingers digging into his flesh with a force that broke through the spell. "It's not her," she said, her voice harsh and urgent. "It's mimicking her. Callum, listen to me. Your mother is dead. This thing is using her voice to lure you. Don't go to it, don't." But the voice had shifted, had found a new target. "Alina," it said, and the voice was her father's, the father who had abandoned her family when she was 7, who had walked out the door with a suitcase and never returned, whose face she could barely remember but whose voice had been preserved in a single cassette tape that she had played until it wore thin. "Alina, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Come here and I'll explain everything. Come here and I'll never leave again." Alina stiffened, her grip on Callum's arm loosening as her own memories overwhelmed her defenses. "Dad," she whispered, and the word was a child's word, spoken by a woman who had spent decades pretending that the abandonment did not matter. "Dad, is that you?" "It's me, baby. I've been waiting for you. I've been waiting for so long. Come to me. Come to where the weight is lifted." They stood frozen, two adults paralyzed by voices from their past, by the cruelest trick that could be played on a human being, the resurrection of love in the service of death. The warmth was intensifying, becoming almost unbearable, and with it came a smell that was the opposite of the grave cold from before. It was the smell of childhood, of safety, of all the things that had been lost and could never be recovered. "No," Callum said, and the word emerged from him with a violence that surprised them both. "No, you're not my mother. My mother is dead and she loved me and she would never use that love to hurt me. Whatever you are, you're not her." He grabbed Alina's shoulders and shook her hard enough to snap her head back. "Alina, your father is gone. He left and he didn't love you enough to stay, and that sucks and it's unfair and it's the worst thing that ever happened to you. But it's real, it's true. And this thing, this monster, it's using that truth against you. Don't let it. Don't give it the satisfaction." Alina's eyes cleared, the fog of memory dissipating as the present reasserted itself. "It's in our heads," she said, her voice trembling but her mind working again. "It's not just mimicking voices. It's reading our minds, accessing our memories, using our own psychology against us." "Then we need to stop thinking," Callum said. "Or at least stop feeling, stop wanting, stop." The scream that interrupted him was not a memory. It was real, immediate, and terrifying in its human authenticity. It was Thomas Blackwood's voice, raised in a shriek of such absolute terror that it transcended language and became pure sound, the auditory expression of a nervous system overwhelmed by input it could not process. And it was close, terrifyingly close, somewhere in the mist to their left. Thomas, Alina breathed. He's still alive. We can't, Callum said, but he was already moving, drawn by the same impulse that had pulled them toward Jennifer's dying scream, the terrible compulsion to witness, to know, to not let another human being face the end alone. They ran through the mist, following the sound of Thomas's terror, and the mist parted before them in sudden, shocking glimpses that revealed fragments of nightmare before closing again. They saw a flash of Thomas's red jacket, bright against the white. They saw something gray, something massive, something that moved with a slowness that was more terrible than speed because it suggested inevitability, the inescapable logic of gravity or time. And they saw Thomas's face, contorted in an expression that was not quite human, the features stretched into a rictus of fear that had gone beyond emotion and into something like transcendence. They found him on a ridge of shattered shale, his body splayed in a star pattern that suggested he had been pinned there, held in place by a force that had not bothered with gravity. But it was not the position of his body that stopped them, that made them freeze in their tracks with their minds struggling to process what their eyes were showing them. Thomas Blackwood had been turned inside out. It was the only description that fit, though it was inadequate, a medical impossibility that should not have been survivable, and yet somehow was, because Thomas was still alive, still conscious, still screaming. His skin had been removed, not peeled or flayed but inverted, pulled through some aperture in his torso and then draped back over his body like a cloak that was worn inside out. The muscles beneath glistened in the strange warm light, twitching and spasming with the randomness of dying nerves. The bones of his ribcage were visible, not broken but separated, the ribs splayed outward like the fingers of an opened hand, and within the cavity of his chest, where the heart and lungs should have been, there was something else, something gray and fibrous that pulsed with a rhythm that matched the footsteps they had heard. And his face was the worst part, because it was still recognizable, still Thomas, still the man who had made bad jokes about his beard and worried about his brother's panic attacks. But his eyes were looking out from beneath the inverted skin of his forehead, the eyelids stretched and repositioned in a way that made his expression permanently one of surprise, of shock, of a revelation that was too terrible to comprehend. His mouth was open, and from it came the screams that had drawn them, but there was something wrong with the sound, a quality that suggested the screams were not emerging from his throat in the normal way, but were being produced by something else, something that had taken up residence in his chest cavity and was using his vocal cords as an instrument. "Help me," Thomas said, or something said using Thomas's voice, and the words emerged with a wet, gurgling quality that was followed by a spray of blood and tissue. "Help me. It's so heavy, the weight is crushing me, I can't breathe. I can't think, please, please, make it stop, make the weight stop." "Thomas," Alina said, and she took a step forward before Callum grabbed her and pulled her back. "Don't," he said, his voice harsh with horror. "Don't go near him, look at him, look at what's happened, he's not, that's not." He couldn't finish the sentence. The thing that had been Thomas was moving, not under its own power but being moved, manipulated by the same force that had pinned it to the ridge. It was rising, slowly, the inverted skin billowing around it like a cloak caught in an updraft, and as it rose, the gray thing in its chest cavity pulsed with increasing intensity, the rhythm accelerating until it matched Callum's own heartbeat. And then it burst. Not exploded, not in the conventional sense, but unfolded, the inverted skin spreading outward in a gesture that was almost beautiful, almost graceful, a moment of expansion that revealed what was inside. And what was inside was gray, all gray, a mass of fibrous tissue that was not organs and not muscle, and not anything that had a name in human anatomy. It was the color of the blur, the color of the mist at its thickest, the color of the thing that walked beside them, and it hung in the air for a moment, suspended by forces that defied understanding, before collapsing back into the shell of Thomas's body with a wet, heavy sound that was the auditory equivalent of a sigh. Thomas stopped screaming. Thomas stopped moving. Thomas stopped being Thomas, and what remained on the ridge was a hollow thing, a skin that had been emptied of everything that had made it human, left draped over the rocks like a discarded garment. "We need to run," Callum said, and his voice was beyond fear now, beyond panic, reduced to a flat statement of survival imperative. "We need to run now." But they couldn't run because the footsteps were back and they were everywhere, surrounding them on all sides, a circle of sound that closed in with the inevitability of a noose tightening. And with the footsteps came the voices, not just their own memories now, but the voices of the dead, Marcus and Jennifer and Thomas, all speaking in unison, all saying the same thing. "Come to where the weight is lifted. Come to where the fear ends." "Henry," Alina said, and there was a desperate hope in her voice that was almost worse than despair. "Henry is still out there. We heard Thomas, but we didn't hear Henry. He might still be alive." "If he's alive, he's running," Callum said. "And if he's running, he's doing what it wants, just like we are, just like everyone does, because there's no other option. There's no way off this plateau except through the mist, and the mist belongs to it." "Then what do we do?" Alina asked, and her voice was small, a child's voice in an adult's body. "We stop," Callum said, and the words emerged from some deep place in his mind, some instinct that had been buried under layers of civilization and was now asserting itself with the authority of survival. "We stop running. We stop trying to escape. We accept the weight." "That's insane," Alina said. "That's exactly what it wants. That's—" "No," Callum said, and there was a certainty in his voice that he did not fully understand but that he trusted implicitly. "It wants us to run. It wants us to fear. The fear is the food. But if we stop fearing, if we accept whatever is going to happen, not welcoming it, not wanting it, but accepting it, making peace with it, then maybe we become useless to it. Maybe we become something it doesn't want." "And if you're wrong?" Alina asked. "Then we die," Callum said. "But we're going to die anyway if we keep running. At least this way, we die on our own terms." They stood still, two human beings in a white void, surrounded by the footsteps and the voices and the presence of something that was older than the mountains themselves. And they waited. The footsteps stopped. The voices fell silent. The warmth began to fade, replaced by the cold that was the entity's natural state, the cold of deep graves and ancient stone. And for a long moment, a moment that stretched into minutes and then into something that might have been hours, there was nothing but silence. "It's working," Alina whispered. "Callum, it's working." But Callum knew better. He could feel it still, the presence, the weight, the attention of something that was not looking at them but through them, as if they had become transparent, as if they had ceased to exist as individual entities and had become merely features of the landscape, rocks or mist or wind. Things that were not worth consuming because they contained no fear, no emotion, no life. "Don't move," he whispered. "Don't think, don't feel, be nothing." And they were nothing, for a time that had no measure, two consciousnesses suspended in a void, experiencing existence without the attachment to existence that made it meaningful. It was not peaceful exactly, but it was not painful either. It was simply empty, a state of being that was closer to the mountain's indifference than to human consciousness, and in that emptiness, the Fear Liath found nothing to feed upon. But the human mind cannot sustain emptiness indefinitely. Eventually, thought returned, and with thought came fear, and with fear came the footsteps, resuming their patient rhythm somewhere in the mist. "It knows," Alina said, and her voice was broken, defeated. "It knows we can't sustain this. It knows we'll eventually feel again." "Then we keep trying," Callum said. "We keep emptying ourselves, we keep—" The sound that interrupted him was not the footsteps. It was a single, wet impact, the sound of a body hitting stone, followed by the unmistakable crunch of bones being pulverized under tremendous weight. And then, drifting through the mist, came a voice that was not a memory but a parody, a mocking imitation of Thomas Blackwood's voice, twisted into something that was almost musical in its cruelty. "Henry says hello," the voice said. "Henry says the weight is lifted now. Henry says you should come and see." They found Henry Blackwood at the bottom of a scree slope that Callum did not remember descending, though they must have, because there was no other way to reach the location where his body lay. He had been crushed, but not in the same way as Marcus. Marcus had been compressed, flattened, reduced to 2 dimensions. Henry had been pulverized, his body reduced to a paste of bone and tissue and fabric that was spread across a radius of 3 meters, as if he had been dropped from a great height or ground beneath a millstone. The blood had frozen in the cold, creating a crust of red ice that crunched under their boots as they approached, and mixed with the blood were fragments of bone that were so thoroughly shattered that they could not be identified as belonging to any specific part of the body. But there was something in the center of the mess, something that had survived the destruction intact. It was Henry's head, or what remained of it, and it was positioned facing upward, the eyes open and staring at the white sky above. And the expression on what remained of his face was not peaceful, not like Marcus's acceptance. It was terrified. It was the face of someone who had seen something in the moment of death that was worse than death itself, something that had burned itself into his final consciousness and remained there, preserved in the rictus of his last moment. "He saw it," Alina said, her voice barely audible. "He saw it clearly in the moment it killed him, and whatever he saw." "Don't," Callum said. "Don't finish that thought, don't give it the satisfaction." But it was too late. The thought was already in the air, already taking shape in their minds, and with it came a vision that was not theirs but that had been implanted, planted like a seed in the fertile soil of their terror. They saw it, for a fraction of a second, the thing that had killed Henry, the thing that had killed them all. It was gray, yes, but gray in a way that was not a color but a cancellation of color, the visual equivalent of the silence that had preceded the recording. It was vast, larger than the mountain, larger than the sky, and yet it was somehow contained within the mist, folded into the white void like a letter tucked into an envelope. And it was watching them, not with eyes but with attention, with focus, with a hunger that was not physical but psychological, a hunger for the specific flavor of human fear. The vision lasted less than a second, but it was enough. When it passed, they were both on their knees, vomiting onto the frozen ground, their bodies rejecting the experience with a violence that was as physical as it was mental. And when they finally managed to look up, to regain some semblance of equilibrium, the mist had changed. It was no longer white. It was gray, the color of the thing that lived within it, and it was moving, swirling, forming patterns that suggested a shape, a presence, an approach. "It's coming," Alina said, and her voice was the voice of someone who had accepted the end, who had moved beyond fear into a state of fatalistic calm. "It's not waiting anymore. It's coming for us." "Then we run," Callum said, and he pulled her to her feet, and they ran, not because they believed they could escape, but because the alternative was to kneel in the red snow and wait for the weight to crush them, to accept the end with a passivity that felt like betrayal. They ran through the gray mist, and the footsteps ran with them, and the voices ran with them, and the weight ran with them. And they knew, with a certainty that was beyond doubt, that they were not running toward safety but toward the center of the thing that had been waiting for them, the destination that had been chosen for them from the moment they had set foot on the mountain. The Fear Liath was not following them. It was waiting for them to arrive. They ran until their bodies could no longer sustain the illusion of flight, until the adrenaline that had been flooding their systems was depleted, and the muscles that had been driving them forward began to seize and cramp with the accumulated fatigue of hours of terror. Callum's left knee, which had never fully recovered from a tear sustained during a winter descent of Aenac Moor 5 years prior, began to protest with a sharp, grinding pain that made every step an exercise in endurance. Alina's ankle had twisted on a hidden patch of ice, and she was limping badly. Her weight shifted to her right side in a gait that would have been comical under other circumstances, but that now spoke only of desperation and diminishing capacity. They had not seen the other body since Henry's pulverized remains, though they had heard sounds in the mist that suggested the Fear Liath was not finished with its work. There were wet impacts, distant and then closer, the crunch of stone being crushed, and voices, always voices, the voices of the dead calling to them with promises of warmth and safety and the lifting of weight. But they had learned, through the terrible education of survival, to not respond to the voices, to treat them as static, as meaningless noise generated by a predator that understood human psychology better than they understood themselves. "We need to stop," Elena gasped, her hand pressed against a stitch in her side that felt like a knife wound. "We need to rest or we'll collapse." "We can't stop," Callum said, but his own voice was ragged, his lungs burning with each breath of the cold, metallic air. "Stopping is what it wants. Stopping gives it time to." "To what?" Elena demanded, and there was anger in her voice, the first genuine emotion beyond fear that she had expressed since the mist closed in. "To kill us. It's going to kill us anyway, Callum. It's been playing with us for hours, herding us in circles, crushing us one by one like a cat with a litter of kittens. The only reason we're still alive is because it hasn't decided to finish us yet." "Then we make it decide," Callum said, and the words emerged from someplace that was not rational, not calculated, but was driven by a primitive defiance that was older than his training and his caution. "We stop running. We turn around. We face it." "That's suicide," Elena said. "Running is suicide," Callum replied. "It just takes longer. At least if we face it, we die on our feet instead of on our knees." Elena stared at him, her face pale and streaked with the salt of dried tears and sweat, and something in her expression shifted, a hardness emerging beneath the fear that was the same hardness Callum had felt in himself. "You're serious," she said. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." She laughed, a short, barking sound that was closer to a sob than to humor. "Fine, fine. If we're going to die, let's at least see what kills us. Let's at least know the shape of our death." They turned, a deliberate, conscious act that felt like the most significant thing either of them had ever done. The mist was gray now, not white, and it had developed textures that suggested movement, currents that flowed around them like water around stones in a stream. The footsteps had stopped when they stopped, maintaining that terrible half-second delay, and now there was only the wind and the cold and the presence that pressed against their minds with a weight that was becoming familiar, almost comfortable in its constancy. "Come out," Callum called, and his voice was surprisingly steady, the voice of a man addressing an equal rather than a supplicant pleading with a god. "Show yourself. We're done running." The response was not immediate. For a long moment, a moment that stretched into what felt like eternity, there was nothing but the wind and the cold and the gray. And then the mist began to move, not randomly but with intentionality, parting like curtains drawn back to reveal a stage. And on that stage, revealed in fragments that assembled themselves into a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts, was the Fear Liath. It was not a man, though the legends had called it the Big Gray Man. It was not an animal, though it moved with the predatory grace of something that had evolved to hunt. It was not a ghost, though it seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously, its form shifting and flowing like smoke held in a shape by will alone. It was the mountain, or a part of the mountain, or something that had been the mountain before the mountain was stone, before the earth was cool, before the universe had settled into the patterns that human science attempted to describe. It was gray, the gray of granite before the sun touches it, the gray of deep water, the gray of a sky that has forgotten the color blue. It was vast, its upper portions disappearing into the mist in a way that suggested not height but dimensionality, as if it extended not just upward but into directions that the human eye could not perceive. Its shape was roughly humanoid, 2 legs and 2 arms and a head, but the proportions were wrong, the limbs too long and too thin, the torso too broad, the head, if it was a head, too large, dominated by a featureless oval where a face should have been. But the face was not featureless. As they watched, as their eyes adjusted to the impossibility of what they were seeing, features began to emerge, not from the gray but from their own minds, projections of their fears and memories onto the blank canvas of the entity's head. Callum saw his mother's face, peaceful and cancer-ravaged, smiling at him with a love that was twisted into something hungry. Alina saw her father's face, young and handsome and cruel, the face of the man who had walked out the door and never looked back. And then the faces shifted, became Marcus and Jennifer and Thomas and Henry, all of them smiling, all of them reaching out with hands that were not hands but extensions of the gray, tendrils of mist that solidified into fingers and then dissolved back into fog. "It's beautiful," Alina whispered, and Callum heard the danger in her voice, the seduction that was the most terrible weapon the Fear Liath possessed. "It's so beautiful." "No," he said, and he grabbed her arm, digging his fingers into her flesh with a force that was meant to hurt, meant to shock. "It's not beautiful, it's a trick. It's using our minds against us, making us see what we want to see so we'll come closer. Don't look at it. Look at the ground. Look at your boots. Look at anything but it." But Alina was already moving, her feet carrying her forward with a slow, deliberate pace that was not quite walking and not quite floating, a movement that suggested she was being drawn rather than choosing to move. "Alina!" Callum shouted, and he lunged for her, catching her around the waist and dragging her backward with a strength that came from desperation rather than muscle. She fought him, her fists striking his chest and face with a violence that was shocking in its intensity. "Let me go," she screamed. "Let me go, it loves me, it wants me. It can take the weight away, it can make everything stop hurting." "It's not love," Callum shouted back, and he held her with all his strength, feeling her struggles weaken as the part of her that was still rational began to reassert itself. "It's hunger. It wants to eat you, Alina. It wants to consume your fear and your pain and everything that makes you human. Don't give it to it. Don't give it the satisfaction." The Fear Liath moved, and the movement was the most terrible thing Callum had ever seen. It did not walk, did not step, did not traverse the distance between its position and theirs. It simply was closer, the gray expanding to fill more of their visual field, the pressure against their minds increasing to a level that made thought impossible, that reduced consciousness to a single, overwhelming impression of presence. And it reached for them. The arm that extended toward them was not an arm, not in any biological sense. It was a column of gray, a disturbance in the mist that had achieved temporary solidity, and it moved with a slowness that was more terrifying than speed because it suggested there was no need for haste, no possibility of escape, no outcome other than the one that had been determined from the beginning. The fingers, if they were fingers, were long and thin and numerous, more than 5, perhaps more than 10, a cluster of tendrils that reached for Alina's face with a gentleness that was obscene in its intimacy. Callum swung his ice axe, not because he believed it would do any good, but because the act of resistance was the only thing that separated him from complete surrender. The axe passed through the gray arm without resistance, without even the sensation of contact, and emerged on the other side trailing streamers of mist that dissolved before they could fall to the ground. "Physical weapons don't work," Alina said, and her voice was calm now, the researcher's detachment returning in the face of the inevitable. "It's not physical. It's not even here, not in the way we understand presence. It's a projection, a manifestation of something that exists in a different." "I don't care what it is," Callum said. "I care about how we survive it." "We don't," Alina said. "Look at it, Callum, really look at it. Not the faces, not the tricks. Look at what it is." He did, forcing his eyes to focus on the gray mass that towered above them, to see past the projections and the distortions to the thing beneath. And what he saw was not a monster, not a predator, not even a living thing in any conventional sense. What he saw was absence. The Fear Liath was not something that existed. It was something that did not exist, a hole in reality where something had been removed, a negative space that had achieved the illusion of presence by making everything around it seem more real. It was the weight itself, the weight of existence, the weight of consciousness, the weight of being a thinking, feeling, fearing thing in a universe that was indifferent to such concerns. It was the mountain's answer to human presumption, the correction that occurred when a temporary anomaly, a mind, a self, a soul, came too close to something that was permanent and eternal and did not acknowledge the validity of temporary things. "It doesn't want to kill us," Callum said, and the realization was so profound that it stopped his breath for a moment. "It wants to erase us, to unmake us, to return us to the nothing we came from." "Then we fight it with existence," Alina said. "With memory, with love, with everything that makes us human." She turned to face the Fear Liath, and her face was no longer pale with fear but flushed with a defiance that was almost holy in its intensity. "I am Alina Vasquez," she said, and her voice was loud, clear, ringing across the plateau with an authority that seemed to surprise even the entity itself. "I was born in Edinburgh on March 15, 1989. My mother was Maria Vasquez, a nurse, and my father was David Vasquez, a coward who left when I was 7. I have a degree in psychology from the University of Edinburgh and a PhD in anomalous psychology from the University of Glasgow. I have published 14 papers and 1 book. I have loved 3 people and been loved by 2. I am afraid of spiders and public speaking and dying alone. I am real. I am here, and you cannot have me." The Fear Liath recoiled. Not physically, it had no body to recoil with, but in the pressure, in the weight, in the quality of its attention. The gray seemed to thin, to become less dense, and the faces that had been projected onto its surface flickered and dissolved like images on a screen losing signal. "My turn," Callum said, and he stepped forward, standing beside Alina, feeling the warmth of her presence against his side like a shield against the cold. "I am Callum MacAllister. I was born in Aviemore on September 3, 1981. My father was Ian MacAllister, a carpenter, and my mother was Margaret MacAllister, who died of cancer when I was 12. I have guided climbers in the Cairngorms for 18 years. I have saved 14 lives and lost 3. I play the fiddle badly and sing worse. I believe in the mountain, in its indifference and its majesty. I am real. I am here, and you cannot have me." The Fear Liath shuddered, a disturbance in the mist that was the equivalent of a scream. The gray contracted, pulling back into itself, and for a moment that was probably only seconds but that felt like an eternity, it was small, diminished, reduced to something that was almost pitiable, almost vulnerable. And then it roared. The sound was not audible, not in the conventional sense. It was a pressure wave that passed through them without interacting with their eardrums, a vibration that resonated in their bones and their organs and their cells. It was the sound of a mountain deciding to be angry, of a glacier deciding to move, of the earth itself deciding to shrug. And it carried with it an emotion that was not human, not animal, not anything that could be named, but that was the pure, undiluted expression of something that had been denied, something that had been refused, something that had been told no, for the first time in an existence that measured its age in geological epochs. The mist responded to the roar, churning and boiling with a violence that was meteorological in its intensity. The temperature plummeted, dropping so fast that the moisture in the air crystallized into ice that stung their exposed skin like needles. The ground beneath their feet began to shake, not with the rolling motion of an earthquake, but with a sharp, percussive rhythm that matched the footsteps they had heard earlier, as if the Fear Liath were expressing its rage by striking the earth itself. "It's angry," Alina said, and there was no satisfaction in her voice, only the recognition of a new danger. "We made it angry." "We made it feel something," Callum said. "That's worse than making it angry. We made it recognize us as real." The Fear Liath lunged, and the movement was not the slow, inevitable approach of before, but a sudden, violent acceleration that covered the distance between them in less than a heartbeat. The gray expanded, enveloping them in a cocoon of absence that was the opposite of light, the opposite of warmth, the opposite of life. Callum felt himself being compressed, not physically but existentially, his sense of self being squeezed into a smaller and smaller space, his memories and thoughts and feelings being forced through an aperture that was too small for them. He fought it, clinging to the declarations they had made, the assertions of identity that were the only weapons they possessed. I am Callum MacAllister. I am real. I am here. He repeated the words like a mantra, like a prayer, like a spell, and he felt Alina beside him doing the same, her voice a whisper that was barely audible above the roar but that persisted, that refused to be silenced. I am Alina Vasquez. I am real. I am here. The pressure increased, becoming unbearable, becoming something that exceeded the capacity of human consciousness to endure. Callum felt himself beginning to fragment, his sense of self splintering into shards that were too small to hold meaning, too isolated to constitute identity. He was becoming the gray, becoming the absence, becoming the nothing that the Fear Liath represented. And then, just as he was about to lose himself completely, something changed. It was not a change in the Fear Liath. The entity continued its assault with a ferocity that suggested it would not stop until they were erased, until the temporary anomalies they represented were corrected, and the mountain returned to its proper state of indifference. The change was in the environment, in the mist itself, which had begun to thin in a way that was not part of the entity's manipulation, but was something else, something external, something that was happening despite the Fear Liath rather than because of it. Callum, Alina said, and her voice was different, weaker but clearer, as if the pressure that had been crushing them had shifted its focus. Look. He looked, and what he saw was impossible, was miraculous, was the single most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. Through the thinning mist, through the gray that was losing its density and its power, there was a line of darkness. Not the darkness of the entity's absence, but the darkness of trees, of solid things, of the world below the plateau where the Fear Liath's influence did not extend. The tree line. It's the forest, Alina breathed. Callum, it's the forest, we're near the edge. How? He asked, his mind struggling to process the information. We were in the center of the plateau, we couldn't have. It doesn't matter how, Alina said. What matters is that we run, now, while it's distracted. They ran, not away from the Fear Liath but toward the tree line, toward the darkness that represented life and solidity and the persistence of existence. The entity screamed again, or roared, or expressed its rage in whatever way was available to it, and the mist surged behind them like a wave. But they were moving now with a speed that came from hope rather than fear, from the possibility of survival rather than the certainty of death. The gray reached for them, tendrils of absence extending toward their backs, but the tree line was closer now, close enough that they could see individual trunks, could smell the resin and the decaying leaves, could hear the ordinary sounds of a forest that had no place for ancient entities and their hungers. And with each step toward the trees, the pressure lessened, the weight lifted. The dread that had been crushing them for hours began to dissipate like morning fog. They reached the first trees, stunted pines that marked the boundary between the alpine zone and the montane forest, and they collapsed against them, their bodies making contact with bark and needle and solid wood with a gratitude that was almost religious in its intensity. Behind them, at the edge of the plateau, the Fear Liath stood in the mist, its form flickering and unstable, its gray less dense than it had been, its presence less overwhelming. It did not follow them into the trees. Callum watched it, his eyes fixed on the blurred silhouette that was simultaneously vast and distant, and he understood that there were boundaries, limits to the entity's range, places where its power was attenuated by the complexity of life and growth and change. The plateau was its domain, the white void its natural habitat, and below the tree line, in the world of roots and branches and seasons, It was diminished, reduced to a memory, a weight that could be carried but not crushed by. "It can't come here," Alina said, her voice barely a whisper, her body shaking with the aftermath of exertion and terror. "It can't follow us below the trees." "Not physically," Callum said, "but it doesn't need to follow us physically. It followed the others, the ones who survived, it followed them in their minds." "Then we don't let it," Alina said. "We don't think about it, we don't dream about it. We fill our minds with other things, with ordinary things, with life. We starve it by refusing to feed it." "Is that possible?" Callum asked. "I don't know," Alina admitted, "but it's the only chance we have." They sat against the trees, two survivors in a forest that was darkening with the approach of evening, and they watched the plateau above them, watched the mist that still churned and boiled at the boundary between the alpine and the montane, watched the blurred silhouette of the Fear Liath as it slowly, reluctantly, withdrew into the white void from which it had emerged. But before it disappeared completely, before the gray dissolved into the mist and the presence became merely a memory, it spoke to them one last time. Not with a voice, not with words, but with a sensation, a weight that pressed against their minds with a gentleness that was more terrible than any violence. "The weight is never lifted," it said, and the message was not auditory but experiential, a truth that was implanted directly into their consciousness. "It only changes shape. I will wait. I am patient. I am the mountain, and you will return." And then it was gone, and the mist began to clear, and the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, and they were alone in a forest that was ordinary and beautiful and alive. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply sat, two human beings who had faced the oldest terror and the oldest mountains, and they breathed and they existed, and they were real. And in the distance, growing closer with each passing minute, they heard the sound of human voices, of searchlights, of helicopters, of the civilization that had sent them into the mist and that was now, belatedly, coming to retrieve them. The rescue was anticlimactic in its efficiency. Two mountain rescue volunteers, equipped with headlamps and GPS devices that functioned perfectly now that they were below the plateau, found them sitting against the pine trees and administered first aid and hot drinks and blankets that were scratchy and warm and smelled of disinfectant. A helicopter evacuated them to Regmore Hospital in Inverness, where doctors treated them for hypothermia and shock and the beginnings of frostbite in their extremities. Police officers took statements, their faces carefully neutral as they listened to descriptions of events that they would file under trauma-induced hallucination and never investigate further. The bodies of the other climbers were recovered over the next 3 days, each one found in locations that made no geographical sense, distributed across the plateau in a pattern that suggested not random dispersal but deliberate placement. Marcus Whitfield, compressed to a thickness of 3 inches, was found on a flat expanse of granite where no fall could have deposited him. Jennifer Caldwell, her upper torso missing and her lower leg still twitching, was discovered in a crevice that was too narrow for a human body to enter. Thomas Blackwood, inside out and emptied, was located at the summit of Ben Macdui itself, his remains arranged in a pattern that the recovery team described in their report as ritualistic, before being ordered to remove that characterization by superiors who preferred the explanation of animal predation. Henry Blackwood, pulverized into a paste of bone and tissue, was the last to be found, his remains spread across a scree slope that showed no signs of disturbance, as if he had been ground into paste without ever touching the ground. The official conclusion was that the group had become disoriented in a sudden whiteout, that the clients had panicked and scattered, and that they had died from a combination of exposure, falls, and post-mortem animal activity. The leaked audio recording was attributed to a malfunctioning microphone, the voices on it dismissed as wind noise and acoustic anomalies. Callum and Alina were interviewed repeatedly. their statements analyzed for inconsistencies that would support various theories, but eventually the case was closed, the file marked accidental deaths, and the public's attention moved on to other tragedies. But for Callum and Alina, the mountain did not release them so easily. Callum stopped guiding after the incident. He could not return to the Cairngorms without feeling the weight pressing against his mind, without hearing the footsteps in the silence, without seeing the grey at the edges of his vision whenever the mist formed. He moved to Glasgow, to a flat in the city centre where the buildings blocked the horizon, and the only views were of concrete and glass and other human constructions. He found work as a safety consultant for construction companies, advising on fall protection and hazard assessment, jobs that were as far removed from the mountains as he could manage. He did not play the fiddle anymore. He did not sing. He existed, but he did not live, and he knew, with a certainty that was as heavy as the Fear Liath itself, that the entity had not forgotten him, that it was waiting, patient as stone, for the moment when his defenses failed and the weight became too much to bear. Alina returned to academia, but her work changed. She no longer studied folklore as a psychological phenomenon. She studied it as a survival manual, a record of encounters with things that human science could not explain and human courage could not defeat. She wrote a book, self-published because no academic press would touch it, titled The Weight, a field study of predatory geography, in which she argued that certain places were not merely dangerous but actively hostile, that the Earth itself possessed a form of consciousness that was alien to human understanding, and that responded to intrusion with a hunger that could not be satisfied by physical consumption alone. The book was ignored by the academic community and embraced by a small but dedicated community of paranormal enthusiasts. Alina gave lectures in community centers and church basements, speaking to audiences of believers who wanted confirmation of their own fears. She lived alone in a small flat in Edinburgh's new town, and she slept with the lights on, and she never, ever walked in mist. Months passed. The winter came and went, and spring arrived with its false promise of renewal, and the anniversary of the expedition approached with a weight that both of them felt, a pressure against their minds that was the Fear Liath's anniversary gift, its reminder that time was meaningless to something that had watched mountains rise and fall. It was on the evening of September 14th, exactly 1 year after they had set foot on the plateau, that Alina heard the sound. She was in her flat in the kitchen, preparing a cup of tea that she did not want, but that was part of the routine she had constructed to keep herself sane. The flat was warm, the heating system functioning perfectly, the lights bright and cheerful. Outside, the Edinburgh evening was clear, the sky a deepening blue that was free of clouds, free of mist, free of anything that should have reminded her of the Cairngorms. The sound was a single footstep, heavy, deliberate, the distinct crunch of something being crushed under immense weight. It came from behind her, from the hardwood floor of her living room, from the space between her sofa and her bookshelf, from the place where she sat to read and watch television and pretend that she was safe. She froze, the teacup in her hand shaking so violently that the liquid spilled over the rim and burned her fingers. She did not turn around. She knew, with the same certainty that had guided her on the mountain, that to turn around would be to see something that would break her, something that had followed her down from the plateau not as a physical presence but as a weight, a memory, a mark that had been placed on her soul. "It is not following us," she whispered, and her voice was barely audible, a thread of sound in the warm, lit room. "It is waiting for us to arrive." The footsteps resumed, one after another, slow and rhythmic and patient. They moved across her living room floor, the hardwood creaking under a weight that should have been impossible, a weight that was not physical but was somehow more real than any physical force. They stopped behind her, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from the presence, close enough that she could smell the wet slate and old graves that she had thought she had left on the mountain. And then the voice spoke, not with words but with a sensation, a weight that pressed against her mind with a gentleness that was the most terrible thing she had ever experienced. "The weight is never lifted," it said. "It only changes shape. Welcome home, Alina." She did not scream. She did not run. She simply stood there in her kitchen, in her flat, in her life that had been built on the assumption of safety, and she understood, finally and completely, that there was no escape, no tree line, no boundary beyond which the Fear Liath could not reach. The mountain was not a place. It was a state of being, and she had been marked, chosen, claimed by something that was patient beyond human comprehension, that would wait for her in every room she ever entered, in every mist she ever walked through, in every moment of fear that she would ever experience. The footsteps resumed, moving away from her, crossing the living room and fading into the hallway, and then into the bedroom, and then into silence. But Alina knew they would return. They would always return. The Fear Liath did not haunt places. It haunted people. And she was haunted now forever by the weight of the mist, by the gray that waited in every white surface, by the footsteps that walked in every silence. She set the teacup down on the counter, her hand steady now, her mind clear in a way that it had not been since the mountain. She walked to the window and looked out at the Edinburgh evening, at the city lights, and the people moving through the streets below, living their lives in ignorance of the things that waited in the margins of reality. And she smiled, a small, sad smile that was the smile of someone who had finally accepted the truth. "I'm still here," she said, and the words were a declaration, an assertion, a spell of protection that was the only weapon she had left. "I am Alina Vasquez. I am real. I am here, and you cannot have me." But in the silence that followed, in the space between her words and the empty room, she heard the footsteps begin again, slow and patient and eternal, and she knew that the conversation was not over, that the weight was not lifted, that the Fear Liath would wait for as long as necessary, for years, for decades, for lifetimes, until she finally grew tired, until her defenses finally failed, until she finally arrived at the destination that had been chosen for her from the beginning. The weight of the mist was not a memory, it was a promise, and promises, like mountains, lasted forever. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.